back for the second week of our world building class. First we will go over what we did last week. We will do a quick summary, and then we will proceed to this week's topic, which is about scale, scope, and most importantly topology, because topology is a scary word from mathematics, but in this case we are going to use it in a little bit different, in a different fashion, and it is actually really important in the way that we think about our game, because this is about world building for games, and we have more focus on games. So this will be this topology section will be more about how we should design our world for our game. So let's get to it. I will share my screen to you now. And I want to share my screen with audio first. Let's start the slideshow from here. Okay. And I should share with audio, but I don't know if I am doing that. Is there something special I should do to screen share with audio? Can anyone help me out there? Let me see. More. Share sound. Okay, I found it. Okay, now there's nothing particular that I want to share about sound right now, but I will play you some videos from some games, and I would like you to hear the sounds as well. Okay, welcome to week 2. And first, let's have a brief review of what we did last week. We talked about building a world, and we talked how we build a world to tell a story, because otherwise we are just building the world for ourselves, which is fun, but it beats the point of being building a world, because we are building a world to tell a story. It can be in a video game, as we are focusing on in this course. It can be for a book, for an RPG campaign. It can be for anything actually. It can be for storytelling in a campfire or anything. But the approach we have is two-way. First, we can build the world, then write the story, or find the story that takes place inside that world, or we can write our story first and then build our world around that. And then we went on about the concept. We went on to conceptualization. We talked about a theme of the world, and around this theme, a genre and a mood. So it is not a strict order this week. You can decide any one of these and then cook up the other two, or you can decide all three of them simultaneously, anything. Then we talked a little bit about design direction. This was about, do I set the most basic concepts in the world and then go down to details, or do I just find a detail that is very central to my story and build up from that, or do I go somewhere in the middle? I have a concept in my head and I flesh it out wherever I feel necessary, and this is the most fun approach actually. Actually, it is the safest approach, because you would remember in bottom-up approaches especially, there is a pitfall, and it is that when you design around one single very important point in your world, that might take up too much space. That might affect other parts of your world too much, because when you think about our world, there are very important breaking points in our history, and when we get to the lesson about the lecture about history, we will talk about these in details. But whether it is in politics or technology or philosophy, in any area, these important breaking points aren't the only things going on about this world. For example, the fall of Constantinople is said to change an age, yes, but that is not the thing that the entire world revolves around. Entire modern world revolves around. Actually, it was a pretty insignificant event when you think about some other things. So, bottom-up approach has a pitfall, and that is we might get caught up in our detail too much, to the point that the world lacks depth beyond that single important point. Okay, moving on. We talked about the two
Hocam,
roles. Yes.
paylaştığınız ekranları bir kontrol edebilir misiniz?
Is there a problem with that?
We see your whole screen.
Okay, this one. Oh, you see this one as well.
Yes.
How do I change that? Let me just. Okay, let me stop the share for a while and start it again. And I share screen 2. Oh, I shared the wrong screen. Sorry. This one? Is it good now?
This is correct.
Okay, great. So you were seeing this one in entirety. Is that okay? Oh no. All right.
And we also see your webcam
No.
as the
Okay.
light.
The other no. All right. So now let me show you the slide for the record. So we are building a world to tell a story, the conceptualization, the design direction, and then we talked about the two worlds. We have two worlds. One of the worlds is the area that the player will engage in, and the other world is the background world that we need to build to make our world believable, which we will talk about in a moment. And then we talked about naming. It's something we have to think about from the very beginning, because whatever we design, we will have to name. And are we naming for the consistency of the world, or are we taking into account the audience that will play this game or read this novel or anything? Okay, so let me just open up another page from here. There's something I need. Sorry. So, okay, let's continue. We will go about the basics of our world now. And what do we mean by the basics? When we design a world, there is something that has to be present at all times, or we risk our world falling apart. And that is consistency. Because in fiction, there is something we call the suspension of disbelief. And suspension of disbelief is basically the audience, the people watching the movie or reading the book or playing the game, accepting to believe that certain things cannot happen in real life, but in this world they can happen. So this concept, this suspension of disbelief, is the idea that the audience accepts events that would not normally happen against your promise that in this world they can, and there are rules about that, because everything in our world has rules about them. I mean, we know about gravity, we know it very well, we know how it works, we have worked out the equations, or we know how some social structures work, we know how people react once you do something to them, or in a way that you treat them, the treatment you will get back is more or less consistent. So in story or in the world, the audience expects this consistency. So you can have magic spells in your world, magic can be in abundance, but if you use magic to solve everything, for example, and don't explain it in any way, and overuse it, this can break the suspension of disbelief, because people would say, well, that doesn't make sense, or there are certain things that in a world you create a world with very firm physics realities, and you keep on doing that, and suddenly you break that. People will say, wait a minute, this cannot happen in this world, we've never seen an example of this. So that breaking point should be a part of the story, or it should be presented in a way that it will be consistent throughout the world, even if it's a one-time event. For example, a very good example of this, and we will talk about this when we come to the magic and science special effects lesson. In Lord of the Rings, Gandalf casts spells, and those spells are not explained to us. They are magic. They presented in a way that Gandalf is a powerful wizard in the story, the way it is presented to us. So it is accepted, the reader accepts that Gandalf would have some superpowers that would exceed the other characters, and he would be able to solve problems, and he is also a wise character, so he knows what he is doing. Even though we don't know the very details of the spell, as you would expect, for example, in a D&D campaign, a player would like to know every detail about the spell, or the game master would be compelled to explain everything. When we read Lord of the Rings, we don't question the magic there, because in that world there is magic, it is not common, and when a character uses it, it is powerful, and that character has acquired it some way, in some method. So for us, in Lord of the Rings, whenever something magical happens, the suspension of disbelief is not broken. This is what I mean when I say consistency. Or for example, you can take the world of Harry Potter. In Harry Potter, magic is in abundance because it is a magical world, it is a wizard's world, as they have expanded it now. But as you progress through the books, you start to see the patterns in the spells. You know what spells does what, and you can see which spell a character can use in a certain situation, and they generally do that. But for example, for some people, this also creates, this also breaks the suspension of disbelief, because I've read some texts that said, why didn't she use that spell there? Because it would have made much more sense. So it's a structuring a world very well enough can also create a pitfall for yourself as the creator. But then again, you can always say, well, she didn't think about that spell at the time because she was very stressed, or things like that. What I mean is, everything in the world should be consistent. The audience expects this from us, and they accept, they suspend their disbelief of the impossible in return for a believable world. Now, this is something very important in itself, and we will always think about this. How can we make our world consistent with the things inside it, within itself? But then again, there is a very important note that I should tell you here. Sometimes you don't want the consistency. If you are creating a very wacky world that anything can happen anytime, again, within some rules or boundaries maybe, but you can break consistency for the sake of breaking the consistency. Well, that might not make any sense, but basically what I'm trying to say is everything we do or everything we talk about in this class can be broken in a safe way, because we are creating the world and it is our world, we are creating it, we are making the design choices, and actually we can do whatever we want because it's ours. But later on we will talk about constraints, and when those constraints come in, a very big constraint will be the consistency most of the time. So when we continue on to scale and scope, now scale and scope are two connected ideas, and they will lead to our topology, actually the main point that I'm trying to arrive. Now what does scale and scope mean? Scale is how big the world is, and scope is how deep is it. A good example for this is Star Wars, for example. Star Wars is massive in scale, it's an entire galaxy. But when you think about that, Star Wars being a galaxy doesn't really mean anything, because each planet is a biome in itself. One planet is completely desert, another planet is completely swampy, one is completely ice, and there's even a planet that is completely a city. So in Star Wars, when you look about it, the scale is massive, but the scope is not that big. The same story can easily take inside a small country where one part is a swamp and one part is city and one part is made up of ice, for example. So the scale of Star Wars is very big, but it serves a different purpose. This doesn't mean Star Wars is shallow. I don't mean this by that. I don't mean that. Because it serves a different kind of story. It's a space opera. It creates exciting stories in space. And that is what it serves, and it does that very well. Now, against that, take the world of Game of Thrones. As I didn't read the books, I don't refer to it as A Song of Ice and Fire because I watched the series. So if there are any fans of the books, I'm sorry, I didn't read the books. But when you look at the map of Westeros here, it's roughly the size of Europe. And there are biomes here. There is an ice land in the north, and there is very hot climates in the south, and normal rolling hills and other things. There are cities, there are things, and when you think about it, the scope of Game of Thrones is deeper than the scope of Star Wars. The scale is much smaller, but the scope is a lot bigger, and that's because these biomes here, or these areas here, are actually connected. In Star Wars, going from one system to another is just a swipe of the screen. You have an effect on the screen, and then the characters arrive at the other place. And the connection in between doesn't matter much. Well, it matters if you are playing the role-playing game, because in role-playing game you have to plan for that. In the D6 role-playing game, for example, they took that into account, and there are routes and there are moving speeds and other things. But then again, in the world of Westeros, the relation of these areas within each other is very important because it creates strategy. So this world has a deeper scope for us. Now, let's go to other examples. Scale is how big is the world. Star Wars is an entire galaxy. Minecraft has 8 times the Earth's surface as the traversable world. You can go even beyond that, but then it starts to break down because of limitations in computers, because of the floating point error. Game of Thrones is around the size of Europe, and Supraland, I don't know if you heard about Supraland, it's a wonderful game. And actually, do I have Steam on? I want to turn Steam on because the video that I want to show you is only on Steam, that's why. Okay, let us update that. So, and when we take the same worlds regarding depth, Star Wars is disconnected beyond planets, entire planets, but you only go to a single spot in each planet. In Minecraft, the biomes are connected, but they don't have any importance in their connection. You just go from one biome to another, and you memorize their positions. Maybe you keep a map. Let me just take this aside. Let me just show you the. Okay, yes, I have friends. Brief. If you haven't played Superland, apparently it has a discount right now. If you enjoy puzzle games, it's wonderful. I want you to watch this. So this is outside, and Superland is around 9. It's a tiny one. It's inside the garden, and you see this is the boy that is the Can you hear this computer? second. So this apparently, can you hear me now?
Evet, az önce sesiniz sadece videonun sesi çok yüksek olduğundan dolayı gelmiyordu.
Okay. So you could hear the video, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay, great. That was my intention. So what I said wasn't that important actually, but as you have seen in the video, it was the thing about the world is that world is just 9 meters square, large, but that is not the point. So its scale within itself is connected biomes, again connected areas, but you have to go back and forth in the same areas because you acquire new powers and then you have to use them back. So when we go back to this slide, in Game of Thrones we have geographically and politically tight-knit areas that depend on each other, and in Supraland we have areas loosely connected with story and puzzles, so you have to go back and forth in them. So how do we decide what our scale and scope should be? Now that is entirely up to us, but we can decide it based on our genre. We can decide it based on one of our characters, because our characters may be from another place of the world, for example, and we might do something about that in our world. Our concept of the world can have a special impact in the scale and scope, or the story itself. So a good example of this is the Dark Sun setting from D&D. So this is the Dark Sun map, and as you can see, it is not a traditional map that you would see, for example, in this slide, because in the traditional sense, when you define the boundaries of a world, in our world, we define it with sea, as we are land creatures ourselves, or we define the globe of entire planet. We say, and this is the place that you cannot get out of. Now, in this continent, you cannot get out of this continent unless you have ships, which isn't important for us now because the action takes place in this continent in the world. But sometimes when you create a map, and we will create a map next week, you take a different kind of scale and scope. So this is from a role-playing game, and this is the second edition of Dark Sun role-playing game, because the first edition took place only in this area, this much of the map, around 1/4 or 1/6 of the map. And then in second edition they expanded it. They said, oh, there are other things around here that the players would like to see. And then again, they could expand it to other areas, but this is for a role-playing game, so it is actually the imagination of the game master that does the work outside of these areas. But if this was a game world, there would be a way to limit the player in outside of these areas. And in a game like this, it's actually very easy, because, for example, Mad Max also has a desert as a setting. And in Mad Max, when you go outside the boundaries of the world, there is an endless desert that kills you in a short while. Or in World of Warcraft, when you try to swim outside the continents, you die in a short time. So, but the scale of this world is expanded from this size to that size, and most of the time the action takes place within this small area. And there's, for example, obsidian sea here. There's a sea of obsidian, black glass. But what I'm trying to say is this world is decided, or this world is scope is determined by the story or the setting, and you don't need outside of these areas to tell the story, so they are left out. Okay, now this brings us to the important part that we are trying to tell, which is the topology. Topology takes both scale and scope into account and tries to make sense of the world from the audience's perspective. So what is going on in this world? Let's try to make sense about it. For example, we have 3 space settings here. One is Star Wars, one is Star Trek, and one is Dune. And the thing they share is they all have interstellar travel. you can travel between star systems. So these are topologically all galaxies. They have, Star Trek has a galaxy in itself. It's in the Milky Way galaxy. Star Wars in another galaxy far, far away, and Dune is again in the Milky Way galaxy, but it is much vague in its description of the galaxy, because galaxy is not the scope in Dune. Other star systems is not in scope, for example. The scale has the entire galaxy because it is set in space, but scope of Dune is mostly the planet Dune and some other planets that are important in the story. The thing is, when we think about these three settings and how the locations in them are interconnected, we see very different things. For example, in Star Wars, you can have a personal ship that can take you to another star system in any way you want, or in the time you want, not instantaneously, but you spend some time in hyperspace and then you arrive. In Star Trek, you also need a warp-capable starship, but it's a little different because you are actually in the real space. You are not in some other dimension like the hyperspace, but you are in warp inside the real space. You are just moving very fast that defies the laws of physics, but you can go there. But in Dune, for example, there is a very different structure, and that is not because of the world's shape. That is because of the world's conditions. In Dune, to make interstellar travel, you rely on a space guild, and this space guild has massive transporters that you have to book a place on. Even if you are transporting an entire army as the emperor, you have to put your armies on these transporters and transport them somewhere else by paying the space guild. So they hold some power in their hands. It is not free to move around in Dune. It is pretty much free to move around in Star Wars, for example. It is a little bit more restricted, but it is again free in Star Trek. But in Dune, nobody is free to move around within stars, and this creates a very interesting conflict in the world, in the setting, and in turn in topology, because in Dune, the world, the universe is very much a medieval one. I mean, it's a feudal one, because you have to move armies from one point to another, like in continental Europe in the first millennium, and it is actually a very hard thing to do. It's a logistics problem. It's a difficult problem. So the topology of Dune, in that sense, is very different to these two. Okay, so when we think about this, I mean, these are all worlds with star systems, but the way they are connected to each other, these star systems, the way they are connected is very, very different, actually. Let me just take a look at my notes. Okay. So, these things also create the nature of the world. So, as I said, is this, for example, a fantasy game that we are walking around? So, it's a normal world that we know, or it's a sci-fi game that we are walking around, or it's a game that we can fly in. What is the nature of our world? Or is it an entire galaxy like in Star Wars games or Elite Dangerous? So how do we move from one place to another? Now this has two implications, again, as always. How do we move in the world from the world's perspective? And how do we move in the world from the game's perspective? Because now I will show you some slides, but let me just, yes, I will talk about it in the following slides, both of them. How do we move in the world and how do we move in the game? But there's also the scale of topology. So what do you mean? It is different from the scale of the world, because we all know some worlds take place in very big worlds, but their maps are not so big. And the best example again is the Elder Scrolls games, because in Elder Scrolls games we can play around in some area of the world, for example, but we can play around in a very small area game-wise. In the first game, the Elder Scrolls Arena, the world is open, but it is not that big because that was the limitations of the computers back at the time. But you could move around anywhere in this world. Now, in Daggerfall, for example, these are the exact same slides from last week, if you haven't noticed. This area is roughly the size of the UK, and in real time, I mean, there was a video that would take running a horse from here to here in 74 hours, and that's a very big thing for a computer game. But we don't know if this area is the size of the UK or not, so it might be scaled down a little actually. But in Daggerfall, we don't care about that because in Daggerfall, it's an early example of open world games. If you want to move from Daggerfall to Sentinel, you have to do it by fast travel. You don't have to discover Sentinel first because that is not practically possible in the world. So you just take a boat from here, you open this map, press the button V on the keyboard, you open this map, you pick a city from it, and the game prompts you, do you want to travel there? And you say yes. And it shows you how long it will take, how many goals you have to spend, etc., etc. So in Daggerfall, you can actually take your horse and go all the way around here, or you can start swimming from here to here and arrive. There is no penalty for that. But the way Daggerfall is structured as a game is that you have to use fast travel. This is important with regards to traversal in the world from the game perspective. From the world's perspective, for example, you can use a ship, you cannot use a ship, you may not use a ship, or you can stay at the inns and you arrive at full health, or you can just camp outside and arrive with whatever health you had at the beginning of the travel. These are mechanics. But again, this world is pretty large. Now, when you come to Morrowind, Morrowind is in this part of the world. And when you start playing Morrowind, especially as a player coming from Daggerfall, you realize that the world is very, very small. Walking from this side of the world to this side of the world takes about 15 minutes or so. Now, when you consider a real world, island of this size in a continent, you would think that it would take a few weeks to arrive from this point to this point, or in this world from this point to this point. Now, what this means is the world is scaled down for convenience of the player. So this is the scale of topology. The world is scaled down so that the players in a 3D world can actually go from here to here and not be bored in the meantime. Because if you want to take a real scaled world like this and move the player from this place to place and tell them, by the way, it's going to take 3 weeks in-game time if you want to walk here. Well, people have other things to do. They have other games to play. They have real lives that they have to set aside time for. So it's not practical. And I will pass Oblivion because I didn't play it, but Skyrim is the one that you can feel it the most, because you can go around anywhere in Skyrim in the map, and this is supposedly a huge place again, but you can arrive from this end of the map to the other end of the map in 30 minutes or maybe 20 minutes. And for example, this is the reason that people create realistic playthroughs with no speed run, no fast travel, I'm sorry. So they say, no, I'm not using fast travel. If I need to go from Mortal to Whiterun, I'm going to walk that way, because it's not going to take 2 weeks in-game time. He can do it in 10 minutes, and that is a time that people are willing to spend in a game for the sake of realism. They may not be willing to spend any more time for the sake of realism. Another good example is, for example, Euro Truck 2. Everyone loves Euro Truck 2 as a truck simulator, and it is actually relaxing. But the thing is, if you wanted to move goods, let me just Euro Truck Simulator 2 map, and it will be a Europe map actually, but I want to see the in-game map here. For example, this is the in-game map. Okay, now if you take a truck from London and go to, for example, Dortmund in just 13 minutes, that is not a realistic time scale. So because it would take at least hours 3 to 4 hours maybe, because it's not very far away, but we know from London to somewhere around here it would take a day or so, 24 hours or so. So basically the world is, it's the real world. The roads are convincingly accurate, but it is scaled down, so the players can explore the world within their time without spending too much time that they are not prepared to spend. So this again, this can break the suspension of disbelief for some players, but for some other players it is just convenient. Or for something else that happens, for example, it's a good example, so I want to share something that happened to me. Okay, let me just draw it here. So this happened to me in Euro Truck Simulator, and there was a road here, and I was coming with my truck, and this is the main road, for example, and this was a blockade made by the police because there was an accident supposedly, and I started to wait, because in real world what would happen is you wait here and the blockade opens, and then you move on your way because you have a huge truck with you, right? But then I found out, because the police didn't move and they didn't move and they didn't move, and I started to lose patience, and I found out that they actually don't move. It's a design in the game that requires you to turn around, take some different route. It's kind of a puzzle slash inconvenience mechanic, and I was very upset with this. So I just there was a tight spot around here, and I just went around it, around the police, and moved on. And I don't think to this day this is a good way to do things in a game, because it broke the immersion, it broke my suspension of disbelief, it broke the amount of credit that I want to give the game about this. I expected that realism of the police to just pull the police car aside after a few minutes and let me pass, and in that way, in my mind, this would be an experience that I would be pressed for time. So I would be forced to drive faster and risk having an accident, making an accident, to arrive my destination in time. But it wasn't that. It was a turn around and go from somewhere else mechanic, which broke the immersion for me. So this is what I mean by suspension of disbelief, for example. Another player might be completely okay with this, by the way. They might be okay with this being a game mechanic forcing you to turn around, because it would also be considered a game mechanic to have a long truck make a turning maneuver in such a tight space, or accepting to go backwards, for example. But I didn't think of it that way, so I stopped playing, basically. So when we go back to our slideshow, where are we currently? Okay, I think it's been a little over an hour, so let's take a break. It's 1:45, so let's meet here in 15 minutes at 1 p.m. Okay?
Okay hocam.
Okay. See you there.
Recording stopped.